Hello, welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about evaluation. Now, when my students enter an art show, I always tell them this. Whether you get in or whether you get an award is not a factor of whether or not your work is good. Every award ever given, every piece ever allowed into a show is selected by another artist, a juror, who judges the work. And they have certain criteria that they judge the work on. No two judges will ever judge on the same exact criteria. So they won't make necessarily the same selections for art. But there are ways in which an artist looks at artwork. As I told you before, what's important isn't whether I personally enjoy pictures of sheep, or I personally enjoy pictures of men holding beer cans. I'm looking around the room at various art that I see, and I'm just naming it off. It's not about whether that would be your favorite piece of art to have in your space, but it is about how well was it designed? How well did they use the elements? Okay, we didn't talk about that for nothing. It is about the creativity involved. All of these things factor into how we evaluate art. So let's just jump in and see what we got. Now, I'm going to walk you through these objectives, even though I'm not going to always do it, because everybody has a bias, like I just said. And you need to understand when you look at art that whereby it's okay to have a bias, you cannot let your bias be the first thing you apply. I don't like orange, therefore I do not like this painting because it is orange. I do not like bugs, therefore I will not like this painting of a spider. Maybe it's not going to be your favorite, but again, we're looking for the qualities inherent in that work that do make it good or bad or in between. We're going to talk about formalism. That's what we just talked about, right? Elements and principles. We're going to talk about context. Some pieces of art work because of the context they are in. If today one of you decided to make some art and you made art about the Civil War, American Civil War, the context now, would or would that not work? Well, it depends how you go about it. Certainly, if you're talking about, the Battle of Gettysburg, it's not going to be particularly relevant to today, and they're going to lose context. However, if you are talking about how the country is divided at this point in time, kind of like the Civil War, you could pull that off. Okay. Whether it's expressive, in other words, have you ever been angry and just started, your arms are going in the air and you're shaking your fist or whatever you're doing? Those are violent gestures. Maybe you've been happy and you've just thrown your arms in the air because you were so excited somebody gave you the exact birthday present you wanted. These are gestures that show emotion. If you were holding a pencil or a brush or what have you, and you made that gesture, that emotion would translate into the mark you made. It does translate. That's a thing. Artists look at that. Those are all approaches that people that are judging or criticizing artwork take. Criticism doesn't mean to call it bad names. Criticism can be to say good or bad or indifferent things about a piece of art. That's just the term. We're going to talk about what this piece of art has to do with the economy or how much it's worth in some cases, cultural and social context, personal context. There's a lot of work that has been done recently about various, non-cis aspects of human sexuality. That is something that is culturally and socially relevant. And for many people, it's very personally relevant too. We're going to look at these different ways of analyzing and how that shakes out when people write about art, because there are people who are cult critics whose job is to write about art, believe it or not. And we'll also talk about censorship and how that shakes out. First, let's look at this piece. This is Dawn Marie Jingagian, Shy Glance, from 1976. Acrylic on canvas, on display at the Museum of Bad Art. And this is bad art. The balance is off. There is little motion. The hair is placed over the face in the way it is because the artist doesn't know how to create the proportions and the shapes to make the face work. It's a bad painting. But it's an engaging painting. When you look at that, you feel that kind of cringy peeking out from behind your hair feeling that you sometimes get when you're just like, oh, I can't deal with this. Especially with the title Shy Glance. It seems intimate and personal. This one is Marie-Louise Elizabeth Végé-Lebrun, Self-Portrait in a Straw Hat. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this painting. The colors are perfect, the proportions are perfect, the textures are wonderful. It's full of motion and it has a certain light airiness to it. It's a lovely painting. But it's perhaps more contrived than the other one. So what you'd have to think about as a juror, as a critic, what are the relative merits of this piece and the relative problems with it? And what about this one, the relative merits and the relative problems with it? So they're very different. They have very different feelings. And it's not like comparing apples to apples. And what we find depends on what we are looking for. What we feel, our own personal values, our own personality. Of those two pieces, I actually like the worst one. I like the Shy Glance because I feel it down to the center of my core. And that is an aspect to consider. So you got to keep your mind open. A lot of people make snap judgments about art. They just say, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, when they don't know what they're talking about. So you got to see. Also, if you're going to dislike something or like something, there must always be a because at the end of that statement. I like this painting because. I dislike this sculpture because. Otherwise, what you say doesn't matter. So, first theory, formalism. How is a work made? Is the artist good at handling their craft? If this is a welded sculpture, are those good welds? You know, is it stable? If this is a painting, do the colors work together? Are the brush strokes cohesive? Does it come together? Is it well organized as far as design goes? Is there something about style that is most important? All artists have a style. And when you go to look at a work of art and identify it by artist, as you may be forced to do at some point during this semester, the way you tell a Monet from a Van Gogh is style. And also, you know, one another thing is you want to be able to look at it in relationship to what's happening in the world. One of the things, this PH I'm going to show you by Titian, wonderful brushwork. Titian was one of the first artists to work as a colorist, and his brush strokes were much more vigorous than many of his contemporaries. So if you look at this up close, and I'm not going to do this, but I encourage you to open these up, to look at the details and the textures that you see in this painting when you open up the closer look. This is Sonia Delaney Turk, Simultaneous Contrasts, 1913. Again, here you can clearly see the brushwork. Do you see that texture? That's brushwork. The vertical lines, the lines of motion, the contrast, the balance, okay? These are all ways that we look at art and we can identify what's good by how the artist has handled the medium or how they've handled the design. Sometimes subjects are treated in different ways, or they're treated in ways in which there are multiple ways that you can look at it. This is Jean-Michel Basquiat, Horn Players, from 1983. And here we have a kind of an interesting treatment of the figures. They have been sort of merged with their instruments. They have been exploded. They have been placed on a separated canvas in such a way that it almost feels like some sort of like sheet music maybe, or a magazine article. There's something very linear and sort of like a story being told. Now, looking at its context here, what else is going on in the time that this piece was made? That's a question to ask. Okay, well, Basquiat is one of the late 20th century artists of color who made a big name for himself. And his work was sort of hybridized with street art and graffiti. So taking a look at what was going on culturally and historically, politically, for the African American community, for street art and graffiti, musically, all of these things during this time can help you to identify what's happening in the painting. It's never created in a vacuum. One of the things it's talking about is the jazz movement in the 40s called bebop. Cut off ear, of course, refers to Van Gogh, but also refers to Charlie Parker, who's known as Bird. And the word dizzy refers to the artist Dizzy Gillespie, jazz artist Dizzy Gillespie. When you're talking about expression, it often has to do with the person themselves. Who are they? How did they make meaning out of their own life? What kind of insight do they have? It's your guts, right? With the Titian, the Pieta that I showed you, that was done right before he died. So there's probably something about your own mortality in there. If you're dying and you know it and you're making art, it's going to be different. It's going to be different. Expressive art. Lots of contrast, lots of exuberant personality, lots of color, okay? Each painting, each artist is going to make what they think and what they feel part of their work. And you need, as someone looking at art, to look at the artist's life enough to see if that's relevant. There are many artists whose life is tied up in what they make. Their personality is tied up in what they make. German artist Kath Kollwitz lived through First and Second World War. Almost everything she does is starkly black and white. Well, there's a reason for that. Gauguin's art is brightly colored and full of motion, and he moved to the South Pacific to make his art. And so he's surrounded by all of this beauty and these big oceans and these swaying palm trees. I mean, your environment and your personality and your experience always makes a difference. Now, big thing to think about also is money. How much is something worth? Now, ugly truth about how much something is worth is that it is worth what someone will pay for it. So if I have a painting and I sell it to somebody for $10, that work of art just became worth $10. So when you see art selling for 119.9 million, as was paid for Edvard Munch's The Screen not too long ago, it's worth that because that's what somebody paid for it. And now you're looking at it and saying, it's just a piece of art. How can it be worth that? Everybody says that. Well, first of all, it's not just a piece of art. When you go to the doctor and the doctor listens to your heart, looks in your ears and your nose, takes your temperature, gives you some medicine and sends you home. How hard is that? I could listen to your heart and look in your ears and give you some medicine and send you home. How come I'm not making as much as a doctor? Well, because this doctor has spent more than 10 years of their life in medical school. This doctor has gone through all of this certification and all of these different things in order to become a doctor. Artists do the same thing. They have their training, they have their blood, sweat, and tears. They have the paintings that didn't work out, the ones that didn't sell, the ones that nobody wanted, the ones where they were destroyed accidentally. You have the purchase of the materials, you have the purchase of the paint, you have the long period of time that you have to work to create this. And for a piece like The Scream, which was done nearly 100 years ago, you have the history of the last 100 years of that painting that's laid on top of that. And with The Scream particularly, you've probably seen it. It's one of those paintings that everybody in the entire world relates to, the double face palm. So that doesn't make them more important necessarily, but it does make them more valuable. If something's going to be termed a masterpiece, there are things that have to be present. Maybe it's in a museum. Maybe it's just that certain people think it is great. Why do they think it's great? Why do we relate to certain art? When we evaluate art with words, we need to get the facts first. We need to know who did it, what the title is, when it was done, what the subject is, the medium, the size, and where the work is located. If it's a reproduction, we need to know it's a reproduction and how good it is. Then you take it apart and analyze how it fits together. That's how you write about art, should you be forced to write about art. Evaluate how important it is according to criticism technique, and you talk about how it makes people feel, what it reflects, whether it's the artist's personality or what. You talk about, is it challenging? A lot of art is difficult to look at and needs to be. Maybe it just is wonderful to look at. There are some things that are glorious to look at, like we said, the sunsets. And then you have a way of dealing with that in the world. Which brings us to censorship. Censorship is in one way the ultimate evaluation, but it is often performed by the least qualified people. The people that tend to say this art should not be shown are often people who do not take time to evaluate the art, do not know how to evaluate the art. They just knee-jerk. And they can't back down from that because it's an emotional reaction. Now, I totally support their right to have an emotional reaction to the work. The work is there to be reacted to. Does that give them permission to stop me from seeing it? Sometimes these various instances of censorship have been religious or moral or political. And some people say that the freedom of the artist has to take that backseat to the values of civil authorities. If the mayor says this is a bad painting, I don't want anybody in my city to see it, that should be good enough. The artist's rights and my rights to see it are trumped by that. That's not how I feel, but some people say that. Censorship has been practiced across history. In the Byzantine Empire, there were certain things that were not acceptable. There have been many iconoclastic movements across time where art has been destroyed because of one reason or another. Much Catholic art was destroyed in France after the French Revolution because many of the people who had survived were angry with the Catholic Church. There have been instances where after the wars of religion in the 16th, 17th centuries, where people destroyed art belonging to one religion or another because they didn't belong to that religion. There's always something religious to stir people up. Michelangelo did a famous fresco in the Sistine Chapel, not the one on the ceiling that you always think about, but there's another one. It's called The Last Judgment. And in typical Michelangelo style, everybody but the Virgin Mary was naked. Because Michelangelo loved the nude human form. Well, other people were saying, gosh, golly gee, that's an awful lot of penises hanging out up there. We probably ought to do something. So they had these little wispy scarves blown across the world and painted into The Last Judgment, where they just happened to float across various people's naughty bits. In Nazi Germany, more than 16,000 pieces of modern art were confiscated, many of them destroyed. And the artists that made them were banned from working because the work that they made wasn't about family and pretty mountainsides. It was about something else. Or the style was something that Hitler didn't like. 1973, Miller versus California. Work may only be censored if it is demonstrably obscene to the average person. What does that even mean? What does that even mean anymore? Freedom of individual expression is valued. If a work benefits from public funds, however, sometimes public funds can be cut to the work. I mean, for instance, if public funds are being used to display certain art and it's controversial, the show can close because public funds were being used for it. But that still, in my humble opinion, is no reason to censor the work. 1999, U.S. Mayor Giuliani from New York tried to close the Brooklyn Museum because of a piece called The Holy Virgin Mary by Chris O'Feely. One of the media used in this painting, along with others, is elephant dung. The Roman Catholic Church was incensed However, what no one thought about is that Ophelia had lived in a culture where elephant dung was a traditional medium. So this painting, Chrysophili's Holy Virgin Mary, was considered obscene and should not be shown because it contained a traditional African art medium and an African American Virgin Mary. And the real question here is, which were they reacting to? The elephant dung or the fact that the Holy Virgin Mary was depicted as African? Just a question there. Now, nudity has been a controversy for many people. Here to tell you, you will see more nude art in this class than you can imagine. Nudity in art is not considered obscene in any way, shape, or form. You will see the naughty bits, breasts, vaginas, penises, you'll see them all. Okay, don't even get excited. But there are still some people who will, in some instances, decide that nudity is wrong. Take Facebook, for example. You know, how many things have people put on Facebook, you know, and Facebook's taken it down because it violates community standards. What the hell? Pardon my French. Some of it may be obscene. Others, you know, I think I posted a picture of a bird of some sort, and they took it down and told me that it was obscene. I'm like, okay, that's fine. That's great. Wonderful. Political censorship sometimes happens. There was a mural in the Labor Department, and it showed bias towards organized labor and a bias against business. Well, people were incensed because you can't do that. That's one-sided. Here we see the history of labor in Maine showing laborers. I don't even know why that's surprising. So, to summarize, there are many, many reasons why a person can decide a piece of art is good or bad. None of them are valid unless you have backup, unless you've researched it, unless you've looked at it through one of the different techniques that we looked at. Art can be censored. Generally speaking, censorship is coming from the outside by those who are not involved in the arts and have their own axes to grind. The elements and principles that we discussed are very, very much a part of the evaluation of art on a formal level. History, culture, politics are more involved in evaluating a piece of art on a cultural basis. So that's your wrap up for this particular chapter, and we will see you next time.